Hey guys, Wraith here. Today we're back with our updated Season 16 weapon tier list. I did one of these last season, but we've seen some big changes to ground loot weapons since then, and I wanted to give my best approximation of the meta weapons and their strengths, as well as a full breakdown for these weapons. So, in my tier list, we're going to be assuming the following. This tier list is orientated around the Season 16 launch patch. While some future patches may come in to nerf or buff some guns, this is on season release, so if you're watching this video a little bit later, be sure to accommodate for any changes that may have happened. This tier list assumes all maps, both MNK and controller, and across all skill tiers. It is a little orientated towards the higher scale of competitive play, so Predator ranked and pro play, but that's because they're the people who dictate and use the broken weapons. However, average player value is also approximated in this, so if you're an average Joe, don't worry, I'm considering your skill level as well. These weapons are ranked by average value and counterplay plus oppressiveness. It doesn't matter that you can get really good value with a certain gun if you can't do it consistently. So that's the number one thing we're looking for. The average value you get out of a gun, how hard it is to use, and how much counterplay the opponent has. And overall, how oppressive the guns feel. Our ranking is also influenced by time to kill, ammo efficiency, damage per second, attachment availability, and reliability. I'll go more in depth on these with certain weapons, but know that all of these factors kind of place the weapons where they are in coordination with each other. And the last note, every single weapon is usable on this tier list. Apex has done an amazing job at balancing all of their weapons now, and every weapon is usable in some scenario, and you can pretty much run anything you want. This is just an objective tier list to kind of figure out what the meta is, and what might be easier to use. You will probably end up disagreeing with me on some of these based on your own experiences, and that's completely fine. Some weapons might be easier based on different inputs, or might perform slightly stronger in lower elos. However, it's very difficult to make a full balanced tier list with all these factors in mind, so some weapons are a really close decision between the two, and if you like using a weapon, feel free to keep using it. And even then, this tier list might explain to you how to counterplay some of its weaknesses. Additionally, if you want updates for this tier list, be sure to join my Discord down below at discord.gg/wraithcrew and hop into the Apex Resources channel for small updates and other infographics like this one. And, you know, if you like in-depth content like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a lot. A lot of work goes into this. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start with our S-tier weapons. So these are S-tier weapons. These are the extremely powerful weapons that affect every level of play, and these weapons have the ability to alter the outcome of games alone. Here, you'll see what everybody's trying to run. You'll see care package weapons. You'll see stuff like that. So, starting off with, we have the RE45. The RE45 remains extremely dominant at all ranges. It has an extremely fast strafe speed, extremely high damage per second, and it can really just melt people no matter what. It comes with a lot of ammo pre-built into it, and honestly, it's just a really good gun. It can crack people and knock them faster than any other gun can, and honestly, it's just a really big threat. Even if you don't have the greatest aim, the sole DPS of the weapon makes up for that no matter what. And honestly, the Re's pretty good. You should be always picking it up whenever you see a Re, unless you're trying to have some fun and use a different weapon. Up next, we have the Kraber. Well, to no one's surprise, it's the Kraber. I mean, it's the Kraber. Extremely powerful, one-shot headshot for the most part potential weapon that can collateral through enemies, has a pretty reasonable hipfire. The only downside to the Kraber is its really long reload time and small magazine size. However, with the lethal potential it has, the Kraber is just insane. It's a really good gun. This gun will single-handedly win you games by generating a knock in stressful endgame situations, or even single-handedly wiping up to 3 or 4 teams just with the Kraber if you can hit your shots. So, Kraber, it's the Kraber. You really don't need to be told too much about it. It's a good gun. On to our first S-tier ground loot weapon, the R99. And you cannot believe how overjoyed I am to say that this gun is good again. The R99 received a 1 damage per bullet buff, and that was enough to send it off the charts. In fact, the R99 is even oppressive now. It has recently received some magazine size increasements as well, and this gun has the fastest time to kill in the game currently, rivaling the RE45. And it being a light weapon, the attachments and ammo are plentiful. It's not hard to get this gun going, even on a light magazine. And the laser sights make this weapon extremely good to use in close range. You retain all of your strafe speed, and you can walk around and beam enemies just fine, even from medium ranges. The R99 is really good, and you should be picking this gun up basically in every single game as your secondary. You can run a shotgun if you want, but it's basically a choice between what you like better. The R99 will, however, consistently grant you more value in these medium to close range fights rather than a shotgun would. So, honestly, R99, really, really good. Please use it while it is on top. I've missed this gun being in the meta. It's a lot of fun. Pick it up. Right below the R99, we have the Peacekeeper. And the Peacekeeper recently got buffed in terms of its pellet size being bigger, as well as the ability to take standard stocks. While standard stocks aren't required for the gun to get up and going, shotgun bolts still are, but this gun is really easy to build. All you really need is to pick it up off drop, and you'll be doing so much damage in close range that enemies don't really have a choice. While weapons like the R99 and CAR require magazines, the PK does not. So you can deal maximum damage output with no bolt off the ground. And overall, this weapon dominates in situations where you can force your opponents to jiggle PQ. So, if you're trying to hold cover like this, no other weapon will do what the PK does as good as the PK does. Even in these medium to longer ranges, the Precision Choke is a great tool to use to actually engage on enemies, and the PK overall is just a really solid secondary weapon. It's in contest with the R99 for a really, really good secondary, and characters like Maggie and Gibraltar are going to want to be using this weapon a lot more than other characters, say, like Horizon. Next, we have the brand new Nemesis Burst AR. Now, the Nemesis is a really interesting gun. We all know that Apex likes to ship new weapons really, really strong. Go ahead and look at the CAR, SMG, and Rampage as the last examples here. But the Nemesis does not stray from this philosophy at all. The Nemesis is extremely strong. It is a burst energy AR that can absolutely output so much damage. When max charge from firing, the time to kill rivals that of the R99, and it has a pretty solid hipfire despite the hipfire nerf to ARs this season. The only thing holding back the Nemesis is ammo availability. You will be shooting through ammo a good bit, as it is a burst weapon, especially if you're trying to maintain charge in longer fights. However, shouldn't be that big of a deal. If everybody's running a really good weapon, the ammo is more plentiful. That kind of pushes energy ammo a little bit up, and you can craft ammo in worst case scenario. But overall, the Nemesis is a monster. It is one of the only weapons in the game that can take peeks similar to it. For example, jiggle peeking with the Nemesis is way better than jiggle peeking with other guns like Jiggle peeking with the Nemesis is way better than jiggle peeking with other guns, say like the Flatline or R301. And overall, this gun is really, really, really good. I would expect it to get slightly nerfed in the future to push it down to A tier, but for right now, go ahead and abuse this weapon on launch as it is in the S tier. For our last weapon in the S tier, we have the Bocek. The Bocek has been in the care package for some period of time now, and honestly, it is an extremely oppressive, fast-firing, high-damage rate weapon with absolute loads of ammo. And the fast fire rate, once you get it going, is extremely punishing and will just mow down enemies in the way if they're unlucky enough to be hit by your headshots. While the bow is a little bit clunky to use, if you can master it, it is one of the most oppressive weapons at the medium to long range. And even up close with shatter caps, you'll find yourself still dealing pretty decent and consistent damage to enemies. So the bow, pretty good weapon, not for everybody, but objectively, it is a pretty powerful weapon if placed in the right hands. Up next, we have the A-tier weapons. These weapons are very strong weapons that dominate in most engagements single-handedly with almost no downsides. Starting in the A-tier, we have the Wingman. Now, you might tell me, Wraith Crew, I can't aim. I can't use the Wingman. The Wingman is not that good. And I'm here to tell you that the Wingman on paper, even if you suck with it, is still a really good gun. You just overthink it. So, let's go ahead and get into some tips about the Wingman. So one, the Wingman has really solid ammo efficiency. The only reason it isn't in S tier is because it got moved to sniper ammo a couple seasons ago. The Wingman, however, has extremely good damage per bullet, extremely good range. You can out-snipe snipers with a Wingman, and the biggest thing that sets the Wingman apart from other weapons is its strafe speed. So whenever you're using the Wingman, you maintain full speed around enemies, even when ADSing. And this is a really, really big factor. It makes you really hard to hit. So if your opponent has an AR or something like that, you're moving at full speed while your opponent is slowed down. If you're missing your shots, your opponent is almost standing still. You're trying to move your mouse or move your joystick way too much. So a lot of times on paper, if you have a pretty okay Wingman, you will win these duels or at least win damage trades if you're playing cover properly. It's time to stop overthinking the Wingman and just start practicing enough, because this weapon is really, really, really good for so many reasons, and most people complain about it. Even if you don't have solid aim, when you get in closer to people, you can really just hip fire the gun, and even hip fire from a pretty decent length away to some result. It's not that hard to use. Just give it a rip and stop overthinking it. Up next, we have the Car SMG. Now, the Car SMG would be S tier if it wasn't for the R99 being better than it. However, the car is still extremely good, do not get me wrong. The car received a 1-bullet magazine nerf, so the punishment for missing shots is a little bit higher now. However, the time to kill is still there. This gun is extremely powerful against enemies, and you will find yourself one-clipping a lot of people a lot of the time. Additionally, with how many magazines are available for it, twice as many as normal, and with the ammo being twice as much ammo as possible, with the most common ammo types, light and heavy, you'll basically never be running out of ammo for the car. This weapon is extremely good, not much has changed about it from previous seasons, and overall, it's really dominant in the close range. The only thing now is that the R99 beats it in terms of time to kill. If you and your opponent hit a majority of your shots, the R99 will always win now. So, you can go ahead and use a car, you can hold on to a car, but I would recommend upgrading to an R99 whenever possible. That also brings us to our next weapon, the Prowler. While the Prowler is actually better on paper against blue and red armor values, the Prowler itself is decently more punishing. Honestly, the car and the Prowler are neck and neck. You can use whatever one you prefer more, but I find that most people will prefer the car over the Prowler. The Prowler is a little bit more punishing with its burst. However, it kills extremely fast, and it doesn't require too much to build. However, the Prowler does only take heavy ammo and requires a little bit more to get off the ground. A magazine is more important for this gun than the car, and overall, the Prowler is still really good. It has a couple weaknesses, but it will just dominate in close range should you get some pretty solid aim in there. Up next, we have our last care package weapon, the Hemlok. Now, this one's in the care package. Don't ask me why. I don't think it's a good care package weapon, but nonetheless, it is in there. And it's okay. It's not bad at all. However, it is just kind of a worse Nemesis, because the ammo is limited for it, and while the fast reload is nice and all, and the damage output is somewhat similar, it is restricted to being in a care package. I don't see a world when anyone drops their Nemesis for a Hemlok instead, and I think this gun is pretty bad. You only really pick it up in case you need the weapon because you're running out of ammo, or you have really bad loot, or you get it pretty early in the game where it can do really good work against lower armor values, because it is a fully gold Hemlok at the end of the day. But overall, this weapon is just pretty solid. It has just a bunch of inflated damage numbers on it, so it isn't bad by any stretch of imagination. But I don't really see why people pick it up. Most people will just want to stick to their Flatline or R31 anyway, or even the overly buffed Nemesis right now. Up next, we have the EVA 8 shotgun. So as I said earlier, all shotguns got buffed with their pellet size, making them a little bit more consistent, and the EVA absolutely slaps because of it. Now, a lot of people will argue that the EVA is better than the PK, or the PK is better than the EVA, and I'm here to say that the EVA performs very similarly to other SMGs in the same range. The PK gets the upper hand because it is better in these jiggle fight peaks, where if you can set your enemy in this range, you are a lot better off. However, the EVA is overall a little bit more consistent than the PK, I would say, and the fire rate can absolutely destroy people when you have upper roll bolt. Double tap, I would not recommend you use on this gun, as it only lets you have a 4-round magazine, essentially, and it's really hard to use, especially if targets are moving. So, EVA's not a bad weapon. EVA's pretty solid. You can absolutely destroy people off-drop late game with it. I would recommend you pair the EVA 8 with the AR rather than the Peacekeeper. I'd recommend you use the Peacekeeper with something like an SMG or a Wingman, but the EVA is a really solid secondary and can outpace some of the SMGs, especially if your opponent misses the first few shots. Up next, we have the G7 Scout. With the AR hipfire nerf coming in this season, it actually makes the G7 a lot stronger, because the G7 basically is an assault rifle. Sure, it's delegated to the marksman class, but it was originally an assault rifle, and it keeps a lot of the values from that class a while ago. So, the G7 Scout doesn't require a lot to build. It at most requires a white light mag to increase your magazine size by 50%, and a scope. And with that, you're basically ready to go. You have a fully built and assembled G7 Scout that will absolutely dominate enemies. The G7 Scout has an insane headshot multiplier, dealing 51 damage to purple helmets, and even more to other helmets. You'll see that the hipfire on it is not that bad, especially if you implement some crouch spamming for some better accuracy here. See, I don't really miss any of my shots. Even in the medium ranges here, the hipfire is still somewhat serviceable. Not great, but still better than ARs in the current stage of the game. The G7 Scout can be honestly used at all ranges, except this weird medium close range, but overall, the gun is still extremely strong, and honestly, it's a really good primary weapon to pick up and have a shotgun in your second, or an SMG even. And honestly, it's a very strong primary weapon to have equipped and actually utilize on the field. So, Don't be afraid to pick up the G7 Scout. Very good gun still. You'll be using it to poke to get armor. You can use it early game, late game, and you'll probably want to swap to an SMG in the later game, but weapon's not bad at all. Now on to the B tier. The B tier is full of fairly effective weapons that excel in specific engagements, but they have clearly defined weaknesses. And this is when we start putting the ARs in. Now, we have all 3 ARs, the Flatline, R301, and Havoc, all neck and neck in this tier. Now, what you like is up to your personal preference. However, I've ranked these on their order based on their relative value. Obviously, the R301 received a 1 damage nerf, and all the ARs across the board received a hipfire nerf. So, with the R301 now having less DPS than the Flatline now, the Flatline, in my eyes, is obviously the better choice, even though it has a worse recoil. The Flatline requires a little bit less to build. For example, a white mag on a Flatline grants you 5 extra bullets, whereas a white mag on the R301 only grants you 2 extra bullets. And especially because the Flatline has a higher base magazine size, you don't really need the magazine as much as you do on the R301, especially against higher armor values. But it's up to preference. If you like the easy-to-control R301, it is still good this season, don't get me wrong. Just when you try to hipfire somebody, be sure to get closer to them than you were before. Don't try and stay in this middle range, because the hipfire will start to fail you in this kind of range. The Havoc is interesting. A lot of people will swear by the Havoc. It has insanely high damage output and a very big magazine size. However, the biggest thing that turns it down for me is the turbocharger reliance. Having your weapon charge up, well, it just ruins the time to kill on the gun by a lot if you get jumped. If you're the person initiating a fight, it's usually pretty fine. You can usually pre-charge up around corners, but if you have to stop firing or you have to reload, you can be caught out really, really easily. And the turbocharger makes it way better than all the other ARs by a mile, but also energy ammo being a little bit rare does make it a little bit harder to use, actually. And it's up to personal preference if you like to use the Havoc. If you're okay with the cooldown period, that's completely fine, but I find that it personally gets me killed a lot of the time. Next, we have the Volt. This weapon is currently in the crafter, although that will change with the mid-season patch that comes. The Volt is the worst ground loot SMG barring the Alternator, which is kind of crazy to say. The Volt has remained a very safe and reliable option for a lot of the time, and it's now underperforming because it hasn't really received the same buffs that the other SMGs have. The R99 received a 1 damage buff, the Prowler received a 1 damage buff, and the car is kind of been brought down to the levels of the other SMGs, but the Volt has just received nerf after nerf after nerf, and it doesn't really keep up in the same way that the other SMGs do. Energy mags are harder to find, energy ammo is harder to find, and the Volt has the slowest time to kill on all the SMGs. While it is the most forgiving, the time to kill is kind of what holds it back from the other SMGs. While you might be able to do a lot of damage to an opponent with a Volt, they will simply kill you faster with an R99 if you both hit the same number of shots. So, with all that in mind, the Volt isn't a bad gun, it's just outclassed by other weapons right now, and you can still run it and craft it if you would like to, but just be aware of this. Try and take poke fights a little bit more with the Volt, rather than trying to full swing enemies with the Volt, because the other SMGs on the ground will punish you a lot more for it than the Volt will. Up next, we have the Mastiff shotgun. The Mastiff is very fun to use, and overall, it is probably still one of the worst shotguns in the game. However, the pellet size increase has made it a little bit more consistent and not as bad to use, especially when combined with a gold bolt. The uptime of a Mastiff is insane now. You can constantly keep firing, never have to reload really. If you keep inserting one shell, sliding, insert one shell, reload, slide. It's kind of crazy how much damage you actually put out with this gun consistently. The Mastiff does have its benefits over the PK, but I find that most people will want to pick up a PK or an EVA instead of the Mastiff, and honestly, I don't blame them. The Mastiff requires a gold bolt to really, really get going, but you can still use a gold bolt to really good effectiveness with the Peacekeeper. Up next, we have the Rampage, the controversial weapon. It's back on the ground finally, and honestly, it falls in B tier because it has pretty sizable weakness of the low fire rate. Obviously, you can mitigate this weakness with a thermite that's inserted into it, but honestly, requiring a thermite is a little bit of a luxury, but Rampage is a pretty solid gun, don't get me wrong. It has its strengths, it has its weaknesses, but typically, a lot of time, SMGs can burst down somebody with a Rampage a lot better. The Rampage is better suited for these medium to long ranges where you can instantly burn enemies with its high damage per bullet. The ammo efficiency on the Rampage is what really holds it together. You don't need a lot of ammo for this weapon to be really, really effective. And if you want to chew through ammo, you're more than welcome to. And rain damage on your opponent, more so than other weapons like the Spitfire. The Rampage sits in a weird specialist area where if you really like it, you really like it. If you don't like it, you really don't like it. So it's up to you. I find the weapon brings out a modest amount of value when you use it on doors, but barring there being doors to break down with its charged thermite, I find that it's not super useful. Up next, we have the last weapon in the B tier, the Charge Rifle. This is the best sniper rifle on the ground, except for the Wingman, but that's not a sniper rifle, that's a pistol. We have the best sniper rifle here. The Charge Rifle provides the most consistent value because of its hit scan nature. It is not that hard to poke enemies and deal a decent amount of damage with it compared to other snipers, because you don't have to worry about things like bullet drop, velocity, distance. The Charge Rifle, you pick it up and you start beaming. All you don't need a magazine, you barely need ammo, you can just pick up the Charge Rifle and start beaming people as long as you have some sort of scope on it. It's not that hard to use. The Charge Rifle will grant you consistent damage, and it is really useful if your team is behind on Evo Shield. You can sit in a building and poke enemies, and overall, it's just a really, really good gun. It's really annoying. I would recommend you pick this up if you're trying to play a support role in your team and trying to assist them get opening and entry damage for your team. Up next, we have the C tier weapons. These weapons, compared to higher tier weapons, typically fall short and are overall outperformed by weapons of the same type or even weapons of different types. So, starting here, we have the 30-30 Repeater. Now, I know there's a lot of die-hard Repeater fans out there, and I agree, the Repeater is a really solid weapon under certain circumstances. However, there's a couple things that hold it back compared to other weapons. For example, the charge-up time is not a really good mechanic if you're trying to pepper enemies down from afar. For example, the G7 Scout does this a lot better, including its faster fire rate, higher magazine size, and less required to build into it. The Repeater wants you to have a better magazine than the G7 does, while having a slightly rarer ammo type and a charge-up mechanic that isn't really intuitive for shooting enemies who are running across in the open. Obviously, with a fully charged Skull Piercer shot, you can do a lot of damage, but it requires a rarer circumstance to be achieved than it would be with the G7 Scout. Overall, ARs, the Wingman, and other Russian weapons kind of just outperform the 30-30. While it isn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, I typically advise people to pick up other weapons after the 30-30 rather than ending on the 30-30. Up next, we have the Sentinel. Oh boy, people were mad at me for my last Sentinel placement in D tier. However, I am happy to say that the Sentinel has moved up a tier because of its small buff that it got. It now only requires 1 shield cell to charge rather than 2. And while that only seems like a minor buff, 1 shield cell instead of 2 is an insane decrease in economy. For example, requiring 2 shield cells is twice as much. That is half of your health on purple armor. Requiring only 1 shield cell is so much easier to loot and manage, especially in a fight where you might need to charge 2 or 3 times because of a longer fight. Going from 6 to 8 shield cells to 3 to 4 is so much better and healthier for your personal economy on your team. Overall, the Sentinel lacks a little bit in base value damage, even though it is really high. It struggles to meet thresholds late game. For example, a headshot does 126, while a body shot doing 70 to somebody on purple armor with a purple helmet. It just falls short of being able to knock the person. Obviously, with charge it does, but you can't always have charge a majority of the time. Off drop, the Sentinel is a monster though, if you can find it early, and it can get shield cells to fuel it against white and blue armors. Overall though, the Sentinel is not a bad weapon, it's just the rechamber time and individual damage per bullet and magazine size that makes it a lot worse. Up next, we have the Mozam. The Mozam was originally better than the Mastiff, but the Mozam did not benefit from the buffs to shotguns this season, despite it being a shotgun itself. I think they more so classify it as a pistol rather than a shotgun, which is understandable. But the Mozam is still a destructive monster. You'll obviously be using the Mozam to upgrade it into a future weapon, but it can be pretty solid itself. Its range is the best out of all the shotguns in the game, and its large magazine size of 6 bullets will let you use it as a miniature wingman in a lot of situations. Don't get me wrong, the Mozam can hold up on its own. If you played arenas before its sunsetting, you'll definitely know how good this gun is. Especially now that it has hammer points again, the Mozam can be really, really, really strong, especially as a late game secondary. You can use the Mozam if you want, but most people will gravitate toward using an easier to build shotgun like the Mastiff or Peacekeeper. We have our last SMG in the game, the Alternator. The Alternator is once again by no means bad. It is probably one of the best weapons to get off drop because of its insane ammo efficiency and pretty good damage per bullet. However, the slow fire rate for this weapon absolutely obliterates it, and that's a good thing. It's really reliable and easy to use, but against better weapons such as the R99 car, the Alternator does not stand a single chance at all. It falls pretty well under all the ratings of attachment reliability and availability, but again, the time to kill just makes it so long that even missing a few shots will get you killed no matter what weapon you're playing against. Off drop, this weapon's amazing, but as it starts to scale into the late game, it really falls off. So you always want to try and find a better SMG to upgrade into, or even swap guns entirely if you can't find an SMG. Up next, we have the Spitfire. LMGs have kind of fallen in this weird spot since the AR nerf and SMG buffs. The LMGs are really good at mid to long range suppression, but when you get close to an LMG, it's a lot worse because of the kind of unreliable and shoddy hip fire. The big magazine size is nice and all, but by the time you find yourself killing opponents, you'll typically receive a lot of damage yourself, and it's not really good unless you're already in a good position. You can describe the Spitfire as a win more gun. It doesn't really help you when you're at a disadvantage, but only really helps you when you're already winning, so not really super great. It doesn't require a lot to build on, but the slow speeds of it just kind of hold it back. For our last weapon in the C tier, we have the Longbow DMR. Honestly, some people will prefer the Longbow over the Sentinel, and I can agree with that, but I think personally that the individual damage of the Sentinel creates more openings and is way more catastrophic toward opponents than the Longbow is. The Longbow, once again, is by no means bad and can output a lot of damage to opponents, but I find that at longer ranges, it's a lot harder to use than something like the Sentinel. The Longbow wants you to get repeated shots over and over again, and not having this huge damage burst that the Sentinel has when charged up kind of holds it back. Skull Piercer is a good attachment for it, but overall, I think the Sentinel has the edge over the Longbow, but I think it comes down to personal preference. If you find that the Longbow is easier to use, or the Sentinel is easier to use, you can go and use whatever you'd like, and swap other weapons in here. Up next, we have the D tier. This is the last tier of weapons. These weapons are still usable, don't get me wrong, but they are unreliable in engagements and are kind of detrimental to keep. The best time for these weapons is typically off drop, and they scale and fall off really hard. So, first up in the tier list, we have the Triple Take. There are some Triple Take defenders out there, and I'm sorry for its low placement, but the weapon is so unreliable and falls off compared to other snipers and marksman weapons. The Triple Take does have the benefit of being really usable in close range with its really good fire. However, I find it's unreliable. I mean, you can see here the difference in damage between just kind of sitting here and strafing back and forth. If the enemy was moving backwards as well, it'd be a lot harder to use. Sure, you can jiggle peek with the ADS, however, it becomes really unreliable when other targets are moving, and weapon using energy ammo while having a small magazine size kind of holds it back. And it could definitely use some changes, but honestly, I'm not too sure what can be done about it to kind of keep it competitive. I'd recommend you swap off the Triple Take and swap to a different weapon instead in a lot of these situations. Up next, we have the LSTAR. The LSTAR is probably the worst weapon to find off drop, just because if you land with somebody and you pick up the LSTAR and they pick up the ammo, neither of you still has a gun. It also chews through energy ammo, one of the rare types in the game, and overall, it kind of feels underwhelming to use. It can be really good off drop, especially if you can get some good damage in immediately, and its time to kill is pretty impressive, but it takes a little bit too much to build and is a little too clunky and unreliable to use, especially with the recoil pattern kind of pushing up immediately. It feels a little bad to use in the medium to longer ranges, so it just kind of falls short compared to all the other weapons in the game. Up next, we have the P2020. Now, you might want to call me insane for this placement, but the P2020 is easier to build than our last weapon, the Devotion. The P20 is honestly a little bit more reliable than the Devotion is because it doesn't have a gimmick around it. It's just a solid pistol that outputs pretty okay damage. If you can hit a good portion of your shots in the hipfire or even ADSing, you can still do damage off drop to enemies with white armor and even blue armor. This weapon does scale better late game though because of the existence of hammer points. With hammer points, the pistol does extreme damage to enemies and can thirst knocks in just 3 shots, which is kind of insane to think about compared to other weapons like the EVA 8. It's a really good secondary weapon, and I would honestly recommend you pick it up once for just for fun. It definitely isn't great, don't get me wrong, but in pubs, this could be a fun weapon to use, and I think it's easier to build than the Devotion, which brings us to our last weapon, the Devotion. I am a strong advocate against the Devotion not being good. The charge-up time makes it really bad in terms of scaling time to kill. You have to pre-fire your gun around corners, which is bad for your ammo economy, especially because it uses energy ammo, and its magazine size is barely enough to support pre-firing against high levels of armor. If you're not super accurate, you get punished really, really heavily, and you need to be able to have a steady ground for the devotion, which a lot of players, even at higher levels, don't necessarily have. Requiring a turbocharger makes it a lot worse as well, because even with the turbocharger, it doesn't perform as well as something like an R99 does. An R99 is basically a turbocharged Volt if you think about it. So a devotion requiring all these attachments such as a magazine, a stock, and a turbocharger really makes it fall underneath all the other weapons. There's been plenty of times where I will start shooting somebody, they will turn around, kill me first before I kill them with a devotion, just because of its fire rate. And no, before you go in the comments and type, "You're a bad lol," consider how much I play this game. Thank you guys so much for watching the complete updated Season 16 weapon guide. Now, there will always be an updated version in my Discord at discord.gg/Wraithcrew and on my website at wraithcrew.com. You can go ahead and grab a full HD version from there and actually keep it with you. You can download it, use it whenever you want, and in the future, I'll also be doing things like Legend tier lists and also really good Legend comps. So if you want to stay tuned for those, be sure to subscribe, join my Discord. It means a lot to me. But without further ado, I'm not going to keep you guys here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys in a future video.